Eminence and Shadow just got a whole lot bigger. Not only is Sid the most powerful in his own world, but he also just slapped around the demonic archfiend ruling another one. It was an epic fight the anime unfortunately didn't show much of, but in exchange we were given a space nuke and an awesome cliffhanger. Today I'll just be covering the fights leading up to that cliffhanger, but when it comes to Sid vs Ragnarok or even Shadow Garden vs Mordred, both have a lot more to it than what was shown in the anime. The former highlighted once again Sid's tactical genius, while the latter showcased some new skills for Epsilon and Beta. So, if you want to see how it is those fights went in the novels, or more behind Rose and the finale to her story, stick around since we'll cover all of that. Let's get started. Episodes 31 and 32. Heist, covering chapters 2 and 3 from volume 4 of the light novel. It's not often we get to see Zeta in action, but it's when we do that they're usually anime original. So despite this scene not actually being in the novels, it's always nice to see Best Girl get a bit of screen time. The actual beginning brings us to the day after Sid's personal spa day, and it's here we find out this whole posh hotel is yet another market Mitsugoshi is planning to break into. This buffet-style breakfast, sauna, and then massage were all parts of a package Mitsugoshi was planning to create for their high-end beauty salon. Sid was of course given all this for free, but to him he felt it was just because that they were testing it on him. So, with the basis of all these features clearly coming from the stories he'd told them about cosmetology and cosmetic surgery, this made Sid once again cope hard with the lack of money he was making from it. Now, the banter with Margaret and Epsilon went pretty much the same, so the next scene brings us to the mention of the Black Rose Brotherhood. It comes from the same vein as Sid's prison break and subsequent joining of the army, which, if you didn't know, are all scenes exclusive to the web novel. This is the original story the light novel is based off of, and it deals with both different events and different characters. Like, in the prison where Sid is just pretending to be a mob character, he reunites with Rose, who's now known as this vigilante called the Owl. She's here to rescue her younger sister Clara, and Clara's the one who's acting as the figurative spearhead for the resistance. So clearly this turns into quite the different story from what we know, but it is cool to see it referenced here in the anime. Now, it's after Sid finds out the truth about the Queen that there was this cutscene involving both him and Epsilon. You see, after coming up with the plan to tell Rose about her mother, Sid would end up spotting Epsilon sneaking around looking for something. She was in the act of picking a lock, and it was this combined with the fact that she was concealing herself that made Sid curious as to what she was doing. So, it was right as that lock popped itself open that Sid would confront her and ask what she was looking for. As it turns out, she was looking for the key that Perv once had. Obviously, she was talking about the ring, but to Sid, who didn't know the ring was a key at all, he simply thought she was talking about a key to unlock the lock she was picking. It was a notion to which Sid responded by saying it wasn't necessary since to him the lock she needed the key for was, well, already open. This would then be perceived by Epsilon to be about the ring, so with her thinking the ring wasn't even important anymore, she could only praise Sid for being so amazing and progressing the plan so far. It was a lengthy series of compliments that Sid just perceived as Epsilon being dramatic again. To him, he had just made the most basic observation, but for Epsilon, she just made it seem like this was the biggest revelation in the world. It was the aspect of her character that Sid hoped would never change. Now, aside from a more dramatic entrance for Sid's confrontation with Rose, there isn't much else to mention until we get to after the devastating reveal for her. So, with all her effort now seeming fruitless, Rose's only attachment left was the happy days she once had at Midgar Academy. What she believed was for her kingdom, her father, her mother, and for herself was now nothing more than lies which felt like the truth. The truth no longer felt real, and what wasn't real she couldn't even discern anymore. She didn't know what it was she was trying to accomplish anymore, and the goal she'd been working towards didn't even seem real. The only thing she knew now was that, more than anything, she wanted everything to be over. It was right as that despair was about to take hold, though, that the Moonlight Sonata could be heard playing in the distance. And the pianist playing it was none other than Sid himself. At first, Rose believed this to be nothing more than just a dream, but after touching Sid's cheek and feeling his warmth, there was no doubt that the person before her was him. Sid would then give his epic speech, and the ring he would leave behind would be perceived as his way of proposing to her. You see, just like every misunderstanding before this, Rose was convinced that this was Sid's penultimate way of expressing his love to her. She knew he could never actually say it because of the pressure it would end up putting on her, but if there was any way to express it another way, A ring intended for their wedding was certainly just as powerful. To her, this was more than enough to show just how pure his love was for her. The ring was no doubt extremely expensive, and the intricate design of it clearly showed how much thought Sid put into choosing it. So, with this being his last desperate attempt to convey his true, irreplaceable love, Rose could see clearly what it was that needed to be done. She understood through Sid's dedication to his own goal that there was no excuse for her not to be putting that same effort towards her own. It's when we get to the next scene involving Perv that there were two important things worth mentioning about the cult here. The first was the way the cult currently perceived Shadow Garden, and the second was the reason Mordred was helping Perv at all. Since Perv had already seen Shadow's power firsthand, he knew the cult was definitely underestimating the enemies that were hunting them. Not only did they just recently start taking them seriously, but the extent of their knowledge didn't even cover Shadow Garden's most basic details yet. There was a severe lack of intel that Perv could only describe as negligence. The cult clearly still believed their power to be wholly unrivaled, but to Perv this underestimation was definitely their biggest shortcoming. It was something he knew he would have to change from the inside. As for why Mordred was backing him, well, in exchange for granting him the 12th seat of the round, Perv would have to use his new authority to back Mordred in the upcoming internal power struggle. The cult may have seemed like this firm draconian monolith before, but in actuality there was all sorts of mini factions within it. And it's the presence of them and the power struggles between them that often present members like Perv a lot of opportunities for advancement. He just has to gain a little bit of power himself, then after that it's all about using said power to gain favor with whichever faction is currently controlling the cult. It's an interesting detail that shines light on something that was otherwise shrouded in darkness for us. It's also the core reason why Perv couldn't ask any of his guards to help look for the ring with him. So, with no choice but to proceed with the wedding without it, what that brings us to now is the setting for our climactic finale, a scene that begins with Rose's fearless rebellion. After having the night to think on what Sid and Shadow had told her, she was no longer plagued by the fears or regrets that were holding her back before. Her mind was as clear as the morning sky above her, and Rose would enter the church knowing exactly what it is she needed to do now. The ring would then reveal the king and the revelation of Perv's shadiness, but what captured Rose's attention was the way this recording appeared as if it was looking at her. By all rights, this video should have been exactly that, yet somehow the king's gaze was fixed on Rose regardless. It was as if his soul inhabited this late visage and was now looking back at the daughter he'd just entrusted everything to. This would lead Perv to go on the defensive, but despite threatening the hostage he supposedly had, Rose cared not for the mother who'd betrayed her too. To her, the only thing that mattered now was bringing the enemy of her nation to justice. So, it was after she reformed her dress into a rapier of white slime that the two would clash in a battle lasting no more than 3 strikes. The first was all it took for Perv to see he was outmatched, the second a series of afterimages leaving him disarmed, then the third went straight through his chest without so much as a moment's hesitation. Before, Rose may have faltered on that final lunge, but no longer was she this weak girl who couldn't act on her own anymore. She was strong enough now to commit to whatever she thought was the best. Unfortunately, she never did get to commit that final blow, as before she could, Perv's head would already be rolling on the floor in front of her. No one could tell who it was that had done this, but there was one person present who seemed different from everyone. He was standing right there in the middle of the church, yet for some reason not a single person had noticed him yet. It wasn't until he spoke to make himself present that the people around him finally started paying attention to him. It was then that the guards would attempt to surround and subdue him, but they too would meet an end just as quick as Perv did. This would lead to Mordred's eventual opening of the 4th realm, and it's here the story starts to become a little bit different. You see, it wasn't Ragnarok that appeared right at the beginning, but instead the hordes of smaller monsters just as terrifying. They would charge at anyone and everyone present, including Margaret, who was actually currently being attacked by one. Luckily, Rose was able to jump in and save her, but slaying one made zero dent in the multiple that were spawning to replace it. It did, however, serve as the moment Rose and Margaret could rekindle their relationship. That only mattered if they could survive though, since what lay in front of them was a never-ending horde of man-eating monsters. It was an endless wave that was multiplying faster than it was diminishing. Fortunately, she wasn't without help though, since it was only a moment later that 664 and 665 would appear. 559 would show up shortly after, then so too would Beta and Epsilon. They had all come to assist in this final battle against the Night Beyond men. Mordred had expected that they would, so it was the moment they did that he would summon Ragnarok, a massive demon that would waste zero time charging straight towards Beta and Epsilon. It was right as it was about to obliterate them, though, that Shadow would jump in and slice its wing off. He had engaged with an attack so incredibly powerful that the aftershocks of its impact reverberated all throughout the capital. It was a feat that was definitely quite the impressive one, but Mordred knew it would take a lot more than that to defeat the Grand Ruler of the Fourth Realm. So, it was as Mordred was expressing his confidence that Shadow would cut him off and pursue the real threat. He had no interest in conversing with someone as insignificant as Mordred was. Since the beast had fallen way outside the capital though, just like how Sid had done in episode 9, he enveloped his legs with gross amounts of magic, then leaped at Mach speed so he could follow it there, leaving Epsilon and Beta alone with Mordred now. For the most part, a lot of this was pretty much the same, but the beginning was actually a lot more technical. You see, because neither wanted to make a move first, both parties were cautiously half-stepping around in circles with each other. Altogether they would come to a halt, then out of nowhere Mordred would engage with his artifact blade. Beta was able to dodge unscathed, but Epsilon, who was just a bit slower than her, got her cheek cut just barely by the edge of it. It was a shock to Rose since not many are known to be strong enough to even fight the Seven Shadows, yet alone injure them. That, however, was just a gimmick, so it was once that gimmick was known that the rest of the fight became child's play for them, especially since Mordred wasn't the only one with an invisible weapon at their disposal. This wasn't shown in the anime, but it was here that Epsilon would unveil one of the most extraordinary abilities out of anyone. It was a move not even thought to be possible, yet here Mordred was getting his hair chopped off because of it. He didn't even see it coming, then all of a sudden tufts of his hair were falling out as something invisible flew right past him. At first it took a few seconds to figure out what it was, but when he realized the only thing it could be was magic, Mordred had come to see that Epsilon was quite literally throwing magic at him. That may not sound like that big of a deal, but in a world where magic isn't controllable when detached from a person's body, to bypass such a limitation was extremely powerful. It's an elite skill that requires not only an incredible amount of mana, but also a lifetime of training in how to control it. Since magic has only ever dispersed when losing its physical tether, to see it being controlled without one was beyond belief for Mordred. In fact, the very prospect of doing it was thought to be impossible. If it wasn't, then every Dark Knight everywhere would have given up their pursuit of the sword and instead focused on throwing their magic instead. That's just how oppressive this form of combat was. Obviously, Mordred wasn't just gonna give up because of that, but he was definitely more worried since the disadvantage was tremendous now. If we switch over to Shadow's fight with Ragnarok now, I want to make it clear that he genuinely thought he was fighting a bat here. Granted, he knew it was an oversized demonic bat, but the thought of it being a demon lord definitely didn't occur to him. The story he'd come up with instead was that this was the anti-Rose faction doing their best to prevent Rose from coming into power. A last-ditch attempt at continuing this ongoing power struggle. Sid made sure to acknowledge the whole Demon Lord vibe Ragnarok was giving off, but once again, all this was just a facade for him. So, as the Eminence in Shadow and an ally to the Tyrant, Sid knew his job was to eliminate Ragnarok as stylishly as possible, preferably a single attack followed by an ominous exit. Such an attack wasn't going to happen immediately though, since the opponent Sid was facing was disaster incarnate. Each strike eviscerated the land below it, and every attack left a fiery crater wherever it made impact with. If Sid was to compare this power to his own, it definitely wasn't outside the realm of possibility, but to pull it off at a scale like that would require a charge-up. Another difference between him and the beast was the predictable nature in which it attacked with. You see, so long as he dodged its attacks long enough, Sid knew he'd eventually come to see any and all attacks this monster was capable of. This provides a completely different message from the anime because hitting hard from the get-go wasn't what Sid was planning at all. In fact, he had even said himself that slashing at Ragnarok would only wear him out too much. So, what Sid had chosen to do instead was literally camp it out like a boss fight in Dark Souls. He had chosen to take advantage of this beast's simple nature and wait it out until the extent of its movesets were known to him. Obviously, he knew there would be certain exceptions, but attacks like that were more so random than the product of careful consideration. They were these one-time moves he was much more comfortable looking out for once the rest were known to him. One such attack had actually hit him pretty hard, but by shifting his body and channeling everything into defense, Sid was able to absorb the impact and disperse it in a way that was the least harmful to him. It was a defensive maneuver he could pull off in his sleep if he wanted to. His organs and bones seemed fine just after, but the same unfortunately couldn't be said for his bangs. They were singed for but an instant before Sid had cut them off before anyone else could see. He would then respond in a way befitting the Eminence and Shadow, not because he was talking to the beast in front of him, but instead because there might be someone else listening. It was the mandatory next step for someone so dedicated to their craft. In any case, with that giving Sid enough time to finish up his preparations, he would then unveil the threads of magic that he'd been laying out the entire time. This wasn't the move that would kill it, but it was the first step in the process towards winning. You see, despite these wires not being strong enough to deal anything serious, the fact they dealt damage at all was enough to make Ragnarok wary of them. This meant he was no longer willing to ignore Sid's magic in the slightest, but what that actually meant was that it would be reacting the way that Sid wanted it to from now on. What I mean is that all Sid needed to do to get Ragnarok to move the way he wanted it to was apply mana to some wires and get him to dodge a certain way. It was the product of this beast not understanding what it was that had hit him, but at the same time instinctually knowing it wanted to avoid it. Since the root of it came from Sid's magic, whenever it would sense it, even if it was just a little bit, it would go and dodge exactly the way that Sid intended it to. So the manipulation of it was now nothing more than child's play, and the fight for Sid was all but over now. It was a simple task since the method to beating it would have been the same for any beast. Thus the reason he decided to declare it dumber than Delta. I know he had saved that title for Mordred in the anime, but it was in the novels that he had actually used it here. Now, if we go back to the fight with Beta and Epsilon, their victory was evident from the moment the battle had started. Something Rose had noticed about Beta though was that she had very little interest in the fight itself. She didn't seem to find combat all that interesting, and there was little personality that came out through her fighting style. That's not to say she wasn't skilled though, because out of all the people who were trained by Shadow, Beta has replicated his style with the highest accuracy. So sure, she may not care for fighting and all its intricacies, but what that really means is she's perfected exactly what it is Shadow has taught her. She's taken the teachings he's so graciously bestowed her with and applied them to herself in the purest way possible. This next part is actually some of the most important info we've gotten ever, so rather than include it as a short part in this video, I'm actually going to make a separate video instead for it. An explanation to Mordred's exposition as well as the significance of Rose and the Oriana Kingdom. They're two bits of lore that are actually quite interesting, and one might even give a valid reason for Sid's reincarnation. So that's a video that should be out tomorrow. Where we'll continue from for here though is right after Mordred is struck by the falling demon arm. At first he couldn't believe that one person was capable of doing this, but what pushed him over the edge was the idea that Shadow had planned to. The very notion was inconceivable, but when considering Shadow Garden's presence, Rose's ring, and the allowance of Ragnarok's summoning, the only answer to all of it was because Shadow had wanted it this way. He had come to see that Shadow wanted to observe them and was letting them roam free so that he could come and destroy the Black Rose after. Once again, Mordred couldn't even fathom how someone could achieve this, but as pieces of Ragnarok rained across the capital, it was clear the only person who could was Shadow. Mordred would then resort to becoming a beast himself, which to Sid was a boring follow-up since at least the bat was powerful. He was actually disappointed since Mordred had degraded himself to a level not even worth respecting anymore. Sid was dodging without Mordred even noticing, then whenever he would look around to find where Sid had gone, Sid would just be staring at the sky spouting his usual Eminence and Shadow shtick. He was showing Mordred he wasn't even worth paying attention to. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny that Sid's attack lit up the entire solar system, but the idea that it did is just so amazing. We then have everyone watching in awe as it happens, and out of all the people who were shown to be doing so, I believe this is the only one worth noting. I'm not 100% sure who it is, but based on the hair I would have to say it's Zeta. But yeah, that brings us to the end of the Shadow vs Ragnarok fight. It's not quite the full extent of the finale, but it is everything that I wanted to mention in this video. The stuff with Earth and Shadow are all things I'm going to be covering in the next video. So, if you liked this and want to see that, then be sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!